This is the final video in my Learned Helplessness series, and I'm going to put it all together for you. It all starts with the patriarchy, which was invented and exists to keep women down. But that same patriarchy also needs women and their labor to uphold it. By pushing down on women and forcing this labor out of them, men have been able to stay on top of this dynamic that we currently have, right? I can oppress you, I can abuse you, I can grape you, I can assault you, and I'm going to continuously use your labor and your contributions to oppress you. Okay, so that's the basic dynamic of the patriarchy. This is also the basic dynamic of white supremacy. This is also the basic dynamic of capitalism, right? Yes, this person is on top because they can oppress, but they are using the people that they are oppressing also as resources and as a way to uphold this status quo. Another thing that happens when you have a setup like this is the unequal valuing of labor. So if I were to draw a line here, okay, we're going to call this the visibility line. Right? Men sit on top of the visibility line, meaning that all of their work and all of their contributions to society are visible and properly valued. And how do you uphold and upkeep a status quo like this? Initially, the patriarchy was created and upheld by men keeping women out of the resource and money exchange part of society. Some of the earliest written laws exist to control and limit women's freedom of movement, of their bodily autonomy, voice, their education, etc. And men were able to do this by controlling resources. Men also used violence, rape, assault, forced impregnation, and land invasion to further control women and use them as a resource. Now let's discuss the labor and resource split. Resources are one of the biggest ways that men were able to bolster and uphold their standing over women, because they cut women off from access to resources so that in any given male-female relationship, the man was the only one with access to resources that buy you everything that you need. Because cutting off somebody's access to resources also cuts them off from access to housing, food, transportation, etc., 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 right? But even just given those three things, if you cut somebody off from access to this, if you create this deficiency, then you are giving this party no choice but to connect themselves to this party that has access to these resources that both parties need to survive. Our existence and our survival is structured around and dependent on money and resources. This was women's only way to survive, to essentially give themselves to a man who would then go out, make money, and provide resources that then the woman would use to support the man going out, making money, and providing resources. And this was the energy exchange, so to speak. Stay with me, because the patriarchy still was set up to extract value from women. Because when you talk about bringing money and resources into a relationship, who is managing all of it? Who knows what to do with all this stuff, right? Who is keeping the house clean and tidy? Who is cooking the food? Who is transporting the children from one place to another? Typically, the woman that would take all of these resources that the man would bring in with the money, her contribution to the relationship was managing these resources. But here's where we come back to the line of visibility. All of that stuff would live below the line of visibility because she wasn't the one that was bringing in money and resources. She was simply the one managing them, which we now know is actually a lot of work. And people get paid a lot of money to run other people's lives for them, to cook for them, to clean for them, to chauffeur them around. Celebrities have paid resource and wealth managers. So all of this is still labor. It's still valuable labor. But because women needed to be convinced that they benefit more from marriage and relationships that men do, all of this labor got to go unnoticed. That's why nowadays we call it invisible labor. This labor was never invisible to the women. It was only ever invisible to the men who were taught to take advantage of it, who were taught that it is not a contribution, that it's actually an honor, because the woman wouldn't have access to those resources otherwise. She would be cold, hungry, and destitute if she didn't have a man, which was true. But it doesn't make this labor any less valuable. It means it was perceived as less valuable. And the insulting thing about this whole setup is that because this labor was undervalued and invisible, it didn't matter how much money the man brought in. So he could bring in a little or a lot. But this part would remain the same because nobody ever valued it at anything. Because of that, this just remained like an expectation for women. So no matter if your husband, your breadwinner husband, was bringing in the equivalent of like 20K a year at that time, and you had to, clip coupons and skimp on food and worry about whether you were going to be able to make your house payment or whatever, or whether your husband was bringing in, 50, 60, 70K, 100K, you are still expected to do just as much labor. It's considered not valuable, and it's considered part of the given that women bring into relationships, because it used to be. Because bringing this given labor into relationships for women was the only way that they could have access to resources. The reason this continues to mess with relationship dynamics these days is because this has never been a valued and recognized part of being a woman or being a man. Men never had to do this stuff. Men never had to manage resources in the same way that women were expected to, or take care of children, or do all this kinds of invisible labor just in exchange for access to money. This meant a lot of women's time, effort, and energy was being spent doing invisible labor. that nobody cared about or noticed. So women had to do lots of different things in order to make themselves seem more attractive to men. This is where physical beauty comes in. This is like personality traits or whatever. Whereas men, the only thing that they were expected to sort of fill out their value with was either money or other things outside of the house, because they had money, they had access to work. They could sort of fill their visible value with other things that could maybe give them access to better resources. Whereas women were only filling up their value with things that would make them attractive to men, because men meant resources. See where I'm going with this? And this is why there's like that whole notion of like rich guys can do whatever they want. Because if you are topped out, all the way up to the top with money, you have more perceived value than any woman, because women are spending their time down here on things that nobody cares about, but things that also nobody would be with them if they didn't do. Okay, so when a man gets rich off of a woman's efforts and contribution and all that, and he sort of surpasses her in visible value, right? Because her value is invisible, it's down here. So he surpasses her in visible or monetary or some kind of competitive sport value. Then he feels like he can add other women to his roster because he feels like he has too much value for one woman. This is where we get these kinds of mindsets, okay? But what you need to remember is that for centuries, men's value has been only ever directly connected to money and the resources that they can provide, while women's value lies in knowing how to manage those resources and knowing how to support the man so that he can continue to benefit at her expense, and then maybe he will share some of his resources with her so that she doesn't have to die and starve alone in the wilderness because she doesn't have access to the same things that he has access to. And these are the things that ensure survival. Not managing non-existent resources, you have to have them first. Fast forward to the present day, and the dynamics have shifted. Women, at least in America, now also have access to money. And money always counts as a visible value. So in addition to the invisible labor, the beauty, the interpersonal skills, and the work ethic that women have gained from having to function within this system for hundreds and hundreds of years, now women can also bring money to the table. Men are not used to this. Men are not used to the fact that women have access to resources now. And men have been taught their whole life that this is mainly where their value lies, in their ability to bring in money, for that money to buy them resources. They feel entitled to a woman's invisible labor no matter how much money they make. If it's this much, they feel entitled to the same amount of a contribution from women in order to keep them propped up here, where all of their labor and all of their contributions are visible. This is why they had the nerve to ask women, well, what do you bring to the table? When the first wave of like 50-50 feminism hit, this is why the men were so curious about what women bring to the table, because they were like, yeah, sure, you've got looks and charisma and a little bit of money, but what do you really bring to the table? Like, I'm over here working, I'm over here making money, I have access to resources. And women were like, well, I don't know, because nobody ever told women that this labor right here is not expected now that you have access to your resources, because that's how men have been functioning this whole time. And the biggest disconnect is happening right here. So this is where the learned helplessness comes in, and this is where the path of least resistance comes in. For women, nothing has ever been easy. Women have never gotten to live on the path of least resistance because men have always controlled them using their access to resources. And other forms of misogyny, right? Once you were married, you were seen as less valuable to the next man. So men took advantage of that too. And they would absolutely manipulate women with, nobody's gonna want you, so you need to keep giving me everything and then some for a minuscule amount of resources and nothing else in return. And this is truly the path of least resistance for men. You have to have resources. Even as a man, like, you're not really working just to provide your wife with resources. You're working because resources mean access to everything. As a man, you still would need to go to work. You still would need to make money, but you just wouldn't have anyone to manage your resources, make food for you, and keep your house clean, and give you all these opportunities that you have to make resources. You'd have to manage all that yourself. So there's a benefit. There's a benefit in this as a man. What there isn't benefit in these days is being a woman with all of these skills, using yourself as a stepping stool for a man who knows how to do nothing else other than maybe make a little bit of money, especially now that you can make your own money. Another thing that happened is that as women went to work and men refused to pick up any of this invisible labor because they don't consider it valuable, women have had to outsource this labor, and it, guess what, became visible. We have a whole economy now built around women's invisible labor that both men and women partake in, and resources go to that as well. Men's and women's resources go to daycare, go to, those ready to cook meals that you don't have to shop for. Those are a subscription. You got to pay for that. Nobody else other than women who would otherwise die and starve is willing to provide these kind of resources in such an invisible and unpaid way. And these resources actually do now have a monetary value that most men could not afford just these resources on their own without a woman providing them for free, and still keep up the status quo and still keep up, the high earnings and all of that. Now that women are opting out of this work, it's affecting men. Because men have never seen it as valuable, they're having trouble reconciling that. I can already tell this is going to need a part 2, so let's use this as a cut. Please click on the playlist. You can see all the other parts of this mini-series as well as part 2 of this video. I'll see you in part 2.